Welcome back to chapter 10 in this video series, and in this one we're going to briefly cover the chapters relating to if science of human orders is possible. And in this chapter I won't go over in too much the specifics of the chapter in too much detail because I think it's covered pretty much in the book, but I will just quickly go over some of the basic principles that I was covering. One of the problems with presenting any sort of model in sort of social sciences claiming that it's a science is that those in actual sciences will complain that it's not really a science and you can't have a science in that type of area. When it comes to social science as it now stands, things like economics, current political science, things like that, they have a point because almost all of it is not real science, it's pseudoscience, it's just fake. And you could see that. I'll cover a couple of points where that is pretty evident later. But firstly, what I want to do with this chapter is just to cover some of those in relation to the model of this book. Now, one of the first ones would have been the issue of experimentation. Now, this issue of experimentation is a misdirection because in actual sciences, a lot of the time experimentation is not possible, and it's perfectly acceptable to replace that experimentation with other forms of evidence and observation, such as you find within astronomy or you find within evolutionary sciences. You can't do experiments in those sort of areas because it's just impossible. But you can model it, and you can use induction, deduction, just logic to figure out what's happening, and there is an acceptable bounds within which experimentation is not reasonable. And in fact, in many cases, if you actually employ experimentation when it's not applicable, it's not reasonable to do so, you actually make that field move away from being scientific to being completely unscientific. That's something you see in psychology. You see how a lot of things in sociology where they do experimentations, where the experimentations they don't make any sense, and it's like it's cargo culting science. They're just going through the motions. It's like I remember seeing a document, a story where apparently doctors wear white lab coats because chemists did that, and they gave them prestige which the chemists had. That's kind of what's happening with experimentation in social sciences. It doesn't make any sense. It's illogical. It doesn't actually add to anything. You're not getting any scientific knowledge from this. It's just their way of doing some sort of motion which kind of implies that they're scientists, and then if the idea is that maybe the prestige will rub off on them, and it's just a giant scam, so it's completely pointless. And I'm not claiming that experimentation is possible in relation to this model, because it isn't, because it's relating to how orders function, how they arise, how they develop, how they fall. And you can't do things like run, as I said in the book, you can't run the Khmer Empire again just a couple of times just to check to see if it did follow the path which we indicated it would do. So that's an argument which doesn't really make much sense at all. And the second one is the question of falsifiability. Now this comes from Popper, and this issue of falsifiability has really huge issues, which I think Popper himself recognized towards the end, in that how you qualify whether something is falsified is not an open and shut thing. It's not as simple as it would appear on the surface of things, which is why earlier in the book and earlier in this video series I said whenever you see any sort of claim to scientific certitude or any type of claim to certitude, I'm working from a probabilistic basis, which is similar to, again, how they do it in physics. They sidestep this entire issue by just focusing on sigma and probability statistics, because you end up with the Humean problem of induction, where, for example, if you saw the sun setting every single day, you don't have any evidence or any way to be absolutely, completely 100% perfectly sure that tomorrow the same thing will happen again. What you can do instead is work on probabilistic basis, in that probabilistically it's always happened. All the evidence we have for the way things work points towards that's going to happen. So we can just work on the basis it's going to happen. And if you employed that within philosophy in general, then you would probably solve 99.999% of the problems within philosophy, because a lot of it is just different philosophers going back and forward on the question of objective or subjective truth, especially in modern philosophy, which can, again, besides that, there's also a problem with falsifiability in that you have to ensure that everybody involved in the discussion, debate, argument, they all have to accept the same standards of falsifiability. If you don't have that, then you end up with situations in which you can move the goalposts. And an example I used in the book, and one which I found recently when looking at reading an article relating to Graeber and the issue of barter. I don't want it to look like I plagiarized this article or anything like that, because I came to the conclusions and came to these arguments completely separate a long time ago. If you look at the issue of barter and you approach that regarding falsifiability, if you look at historical records, as Graeber pointed out, there is no record of barter in the Adam Smith and economic sense as it's taught in economic textbooks. There's no evidence for it. There's no archaeological evidence. There's no anthropological evidence. It doesn't even really make much sense logically when you trace it all the way back. Now, we've encountered thousands of non-Western orders living in what we call primitive orders. None of them operated on the barter system as outlined by Adam Smith in, I think it was The Wealth of Nations. Even if you look through our historical records of Western orders, we don't find any evidence of people operating within a barter system according to how economists claim it did prior to money. In fact, we also have evidence of how people operated prior to the development of coinage especially, and there's zero evidence of barter. They're usually operating on some sort of temple system, some sort of longhouse system, something along those lines. None of it has any evidence at all. But if you present that to an economist, how I would have thought they would have figured it out was they would have looked at it and gone, well, maybe the evidence is somewhere in the past and we just haven't found it. And in this article, which I'll put up on the screen, I mean, that's kind of what it did. They just said, oh, it must have been a short period and it's left no record in the archaeological record. That is abuse of the falsifiability issue, because you can just look at that and you can tell immediately these people are not acting in good faith in relation to this. Because as this article points out, and as I point out in the book, if you're approaching this scientifically, the only real logical and reasonable conclusion to draw from this would be that the barter system is completely wrong. It should not be taught. It should not be presented as a possible idea. And all subsequent ideas which develop from that barter system, economic ideas, should be reassessed completely. And the status of economics as a science should be put under serious debate on this basis alone. But of course it won't, and that's something we'll come back to in a later chapter. But in the meantime, in this chapter, we'll just keep focusing on this scientific issue. And the next issue is that of normativity. It's the idea of bringing in prejudices and your beliefs. It's going to be the is-or distinction. When it comes to sciences, there's going to be a lot of areas where normativity absolutely should not be in place. And the example I give in the book is the classification of animals. You if you're going to classify cats, big cats in the Felidae family, you can't. That would be a scientific classification. That would make sense, and it's logical. It follows. But if you introduce normativity into this, and you try to classify animals on a normative basis, say for example animals you liked and animals you didn't like, that wouldn't be a scientific approach to this. Whereas approaching it cladistically and using family trees and using genetics as well is a scientific approach. But when it comes to human orders, there is areas in which normativity does enter into matters, because humans are not non-thinking robotic type creatures that just respond to stimuli. So there are going to be areas in which you have to factor that in, and if you don't factor that in, And if you try and brute force humans into being like atomic particles, which is what people like Descartes and Hobbes and basically all the liberal tradition has tried to do, that is not scientific. That is anti-scientific. You're completely ignoring evidence and information, and it's completely self-serving. So that's what you have with like Hobbes. Again, Hobbes and Descartes. And one of the big areas you have a problem with this in political theory, political science especially, is in the classifications of government. Classifying human orders in relation to democracy, aristocracy, tyranny, all of those different ones, they are completely normative. It doesn't follow scientific classifications at all, because you can change them quite drastically over different time periods, and nobody's actually settled on a very good explanation of what definition is applicable to which one. It's an entirely normative process. So that's one of the reasons why I've completely disregarded the political categories in modeling the work, which has helped me, I believe, to actually present a model which is scientific, because on that level it doesn't introduce normativity, whereas on other levels it accepts normativity in relation to the behavior of the agents within the model. And this brings us to the next point, which I wanted to criticize. Wanted to point out with regards to criticism of it being potentially unscientific, and that's the issue of free will. What I'm not claiming here is that those acting within this model do not have free will. What I'm claiming within the model is that if there's any free will, and my personal opinion on this is there is, that free will can only act out within the parameters of that period of time in which that person lived. However, if that person is aware of these parameters, then that won't open up the scope of their possible free will at that point in time. And yeah, I don't want to get into a debate or argument over the issue of free will, because I know it's far, far more complicated than what I've just pointed out there. So I'll just point out that I'm not taking a position really in the model at all. But what I am doing is pointing out the potential absurdity of the argument in relation to the model. Because, as I point out in the model, imagine if you... For one, the model doesn't discount the possibility of major shocks. So an individual who comes along and just seemingly changes the game entirely and just drags everybody off in a completely different direction. So like Alexander the Great or a Napoleon. They're types of people who you can't really model in advance. But what the model isn't trying to do that. What the model is trying to do is to explain the environment which could create the potential of such a person, and to explain how such a person developed what they did. For example, with Alexander the Great, it's the centralization process which his father did in the Macedonian kingdom that put in place the military machinery that Alexander could employ. And it was the political system or the organizational system of the Persians which allowed Alexander to make the inroads which he did in the first place, in the first battle of Granicus, and then the second battle I think was Issus, and then it's their system of organization which allowed Alexander to take advantage. And then subsequently, you can see in Alexander the Great's behavior that he's following along the logic of this model. And one of the things which actually made me realize that Juvenal was completely correct was reading Arrian's account of Alexander's campaigns, and especially the event of the mutiny of his army in India or around India. Because the reason why Alexander the Great's Macedonian army mutinied and he had to turn back from India was that Alexander, I think it was actually maybe a little bit before this, if my memory serves me correct. It might not have been exactly in India, it might have been previous to this. But they mutinied because what was happening was Alexander was trying to bring in Persian nobility and Persian youth and training them up in the Macedonian ways of war and dressing them as Macedonians. And his court was also dressing themselves in Persian dress. So what he was trying to do was to try and incorporate his new possessions and his new subjects into his military machinery. Now, by doing that, he would have been removing the threat they had from his generals, because he was constantly under threat from his other generals, because he was constantly executing them. There was many different periods when there was obviously court intrigues happening. So what happened there is that's definitely an example of what you'd see in Juvenal of high, middle, low. You've got Alexander in his court bringing Macedonians, who would have been the low, into his army, into his system. And then you have the Macedonians in that situation who would have been the middle, revolting because they realized what's happening there. He's making a grasp for power, which they would not be able to keep control on. In that instance, they won. But that's a very clear indication of the Juvenalian mechanism in historical setting. So even though Alexander was an exceptional human being who was able to do incredible things which you could not model in advance, because you can't model someone with that level of bravery and recklessness and just pure luck by the looks of things, but you can explain his behavior as he's going and how he was able to be in such a situation to actually do that in the first place, which is what the model is attempting to do. What the model also does is it puts additional bounds on that free will by focusing on the issue of traditions. And again, the example I used in the book was to use an extreme example. You couldn't claim that a medieval person could sit there and dream up the concept of an F-22 Raptor and draw out the blueprints of it any more than you can claim that Napoleon Bonaparte, if you transferred him as a baby to prehistoric, Paleolithic North Africa, could just, when he's in his 20s, raise a grand army in North Africa and launch a campaign across North Africa and Europe to conquer it. It's not reasonable and it's not logical, because those people are inhabiting a tradition and a language system and a social and organizational structure at that time which only allows certain things to be possible. Again, if you presented those people with these ideas like the Raptor, and you could present Napoleon Bonaparte in prehistoric North Africa with this idea, they'll be able to understand it. Maybe they'd want to be able to employ that, but they couldn't do that because there's a massive web of other categories, concepts, organizational principles, organizational structures, all different things which would be necessary for that to happen. And this issue of traditions provides a subsequent bounding which allows this model to be very much scientific. And the reason for that is because you can model these traditions developing in specific ways, and you can model the possible ideas and possible concepts which can maybe come from these different traditions. And it gives you a bounding to actually track and trace ideas and the way that different orders move and drift and change. This is something which is completely impossible within agent-based models such as liberalism, where the individual has to be treated as like a black box, and the only way you can get any sort of idea of what's going to happen is by treating them, as I said in previous chapters, like amoebas who just respond to outside influences like electric fields or something like that. So it's like, again, Hobbes's everybody created a complex civilization because they were scared of each other. So you have to give this fear to actually try and give some idea of why these things are moving at all. So this chapter is actually quite a short one. It's not that detailed, and it's just there to just point out that the criticisms of social sciences and things like economics don't really apply to this model, because I'm not approaching it from their underlying priors and their underlying models. So to apply the criticisms which do apply to them to this model is not correct. It's not reasonable, and it doesn't really work, because I'm approaching this from a completely different direction. And with that in mind, I did want to go off on a little tangent with this in relation to the issue of evidence in science. Because one of the things I think which is not receiving as much focus as it should do in the modern period is that all of liberalism, all of political theory as it stands up until now, is based upon an understanding of anthropology, an understanding of the evidence of history, which has been completely overthrown. I mean, we've gone through this many times in previous chapters, previous videos, when we've talked about the anthropological issues related to retrojection. But the archaeological evidence which is coming through now and anthropological studies which are being developed now are of such magnitude that we should really be in a position where we should be taking modern political theory and literally throwing it all in the trash. For example, again, we'll go back to the barter issue. If you've gone to thousands of different orders and you found zero evidence of barter in those thousands of orders, you shouldn't be able to get away with saying, well, maybe it'll be in the next one, or maybe we'll find it in some in historical evidence or archaeological records at some point. That should not be acceptable, but that's what economics does. And it's the same with political theory as well. Liberalism is premised upon an understanding of these orders in like North and South America and the idea of a state of nature, which at that time would have been reasonable to entertain because they didn't have really any archaeological evidence. And that would have been the case maybe for a couple of hundred years after that. But in 20th and 21st century especially, the wealth of evidence which we now have is so great that the idea that there's a state of nature is just beyond the pale. We are finding evidence of a pretty large-scale organizations going back to the Paleolithic. And I can't imagine what evidence will start to come from the Ice Age and maybe even earlier than that, which will show that humans have been in very large-scale organizations and been engaged in long-range trade, which has not managed to survive in a large-scale archaeological evidence and just is being found in little bits and pieces. Because most of it would have been in things using things like wood or biodegradable material, which doesn't survive very well, or they would have been in areas which have been subject to flooding or just general change, because the Earth has changed quite a lot over the period. So when you factor in all of this new evidence, things like Hobbes, things like Locke, things like even Marx to a large degree, even though I would salvage lots of his thought, their thought should not really be applicable within political sciences. The political sciences should be in a position where they should be reassessing all of this and basically coming to the conclusion that they should start again. But in this chapter, I just wanted to focus a little bit on these archaeological discoveries and things like Graeber and Salins' work, which I don't think people realize the full implications of a lot of this. Like one of the big influences on my book was On Kings by Graeber and Salins, especially his focus on the interaction between kings and their wider, you'd probably call it community, but I'd call it like the nobility or lower intermediaries. Because as I've pointed out in the previous chapter, he's very much on to the point that you have upper intermediaries and lower intermediaries, and these two aspects of these orders are constantly in a state of tension. And this would have been well understood in most of history and most of human organization until the modern period, when we came to the conclusion that, oh no, we have Hobbesian sovereignty, in which case we've just been completely confused. And then there's also the historical archaeological evidence which Salins brings as well in relation to things like cannibalism and the ritual world order of these previous peoples. Because I've seen Salins get criticism because he opposed one of the anthropologists who was claiming that these tribal people demonstrate severe violence, which gives them some sort of Darwinian advantage, and that he was then basically a liberal, and he was being soft and not being reasonable. But actually, that's not what Salins was doing. This idea that these different tribes are engaging in violence and going through Darwinian selection in relation to this violence, if you actually study these different orders and you actually look at them in detail, you'd see that's quite ridiculous quite quickly, because a lot of the violence that these people are engaging in and a lot of the behavior they're engaging in is actually completely irrational or unexplainable from a Darwinian perspective, unless you employ really complex arguments to try and get around it. I mean, you have things like hook swinging, where they would hook themselves onto chains and then swing around the pole with the hooks in their back. Or you would have this ritual cannibalism or mortuary cannibalism, where they're eating the dead relatives, and or just chopping off their fingers, which just leaves people completely confused from a Darwinian selection perspective. Because if you're chopping off your own fingers, surely that creates a situation where you have less potential selection, but actually these people seem to be doing perfectly fine. And Salins was actually quite adamant that anthropologists should be fully aware of this sort of behavior, especially, like, for example, cannibalism in places like Fiji, because he was very upset. I remember reading he was very upset that things like Fiji cannibalism is not taught or not understood by anthropologists. Now, if you then approach Salins as being like a wet liberal who was opposed to presenting these people as being violent or anything like that, that doesn't make any sense. Because if you have any understanding of what was happening in Fiji, which was called the Cannibal Island, you would understand that the idea that Salins was encouraging people to learn about this, but at the same time trying to present these people as being perfectly peaceful and harmless, is quite absurd. Because one of the best books to read on this type of thing is a book by a guy called, I think, Gary Hogg, who wrote a book about human sacrifice and cannibalism. And I don't know if you can find it online now, but if you can get a hold of a copy, it's an exceptional book. It's even if you're not really interested in that type of thing, it's just like an adventure book. You're going through it and you're just reading things which is leaving your jaw on the floor. Because Fiji was called this Cannibal Island because the cannibalism there was so prevalent and so severe, and their behavior was so unreal. It's the type of thing that would have made John Wayne Gacy or Ed Gein look like complete amateurs. They would, like, you would have, I'm not sure if YouTube's going to let me get away with this, but I'll do it anyway. You would have things where you'd have Christian missionaries going there, staying there, and they'd complain because the locals would be throwing body parts into their garden every single day and thinking it was funny. Or you'd have situations where apparently they would capture people alive, and then they would stomp on their chest to break their ribs so they couldn't scream, and then they'd start eating them alive, limb by limb, while they were watching. And that was apparently like part of their process of doing that. This is why, again, Fiji was called Cannibal Islands. And you have other places where this type of behavior along these lines was just was almost as bad. I mean, if not probably worse, on scale at least. Like, we know the Aztecs, they were doing things like flaying people alive and then dancing around in their skins, or they were sacrificing children and just doing all sorts of bizarre rituals in the process. And if you look throughout the entirety of the world, this seems to be like pretty much standard practice throughout everywhere. I mean, I know the New Zealanders were doing it. Again, this is something probably I don't know about YouTube would accept this, but the accounts of Aboriginals eating their children are very, very persuasive, consistent, and come from different sources. It seems like in some periods of time, in some years, they were pretty much just eating all of the newborn babies. Now, the reason for this behavior is, again, it's unclear, but it's not animalistic. It's very much human, which is one of those shocking things which modern political theory cannot process. This cannibalism is not animalistic. They're not acting like animals. In many cases, it's entirely ritualistic. And it's got specific purpose, which is completely human. I'm not saying that we should accept cannibalism or that we should celebrate or anything like that. What I'm saying is it's actually data and information which you cannot disregard, because doing so is unscientific. And the evidence we're getting from cannibalism going way back in the past is completely irrefutable at this point. I mean, we have lots of evidence of Neanderthals engaging in quite widespread cannibalism, as well as humans as well. I mean, in England, I think it's Cheddar Gorge, somewhere around there, they have evidence of people apparently who were cannibalizing plague victims, which boggles the mind. But that's, again, it's just completely widespread behavior. And that's information which you have to factor into any political theory. Now, if you look at liberal political theory or Marxist, or just mainly liberal, none of this can be explained at all. How do you explain any of this from self-interest or from fear of each other? None of that makes any sense at all. And how can you have a political science then which has this wealth, absolute overwhelming wealth of information at their fingertips, which they cannot process in any way, shape, or form? At that point, you have to stop and just acknowledge that maybe political science has got nothing to do with science, and it's more like a political theology, really, which I think many within those fields would probably admit in private. Because, I mean, if your entire political theory, system, political science process is based upon this state of nature, and there's been zero evidence of this state of nature in the same way as with the barter theory of money, nobody's found any orders which are operating on that basis. Nobody's found any archaeological evidence of a state of nature anywhere along the line. It doesn't even logically make any sense at this point, given the information we have at hand. We can't find it in genetic records or anything like that as well, because, I mean, surely that would be something which would show up in genetic studies, because you'd find different selection pressures occurring at that point, so you'd be able to see that something happened there. So you should be able to do it through genetics as well, which obviously we haven't done, because geneticists would probably point that out by now. So when you've got a situation where zero evidence, just no evidence at all, it's completely indefensible. I mean, we've passed the point where I'm sure if you applied statistical modeling to it, you'd get way past Six Sigma, surely. I mean, there's thousands and thousands and thousands of data points which you can apply, which would completely point in the opposite direction to there being a state of nature. But this is completely what liberalism and political science is based upon. So the question really is, why is this acceptable? Why are the political sciences allowed to do this? And that's something we'll get to in a later chapter, because it's basically completely related to issues of power.